The tenant. My name's Dale, and I own many properties, which most are for rent. I try my best to keep my tenants happy and comfortable within my places. Not to sound like a creep, but in a way it feels like I look after these people like they're my own kids, since I had never had any of my own, or even a life partner for that matter. So I like to keep them happy and at times check in to make sure their needs are met. One particular time, on the end of every month, I go to collect the rent, and most of which is money transferred and online, which just makes things easier. Usually all would be accounted for. But this one tenant who I knew liked his alone time, never paid up. I waited a few days to give him time since I just thought he was a little late, but those days went by and nothing. A week later, and still nothing. Being a landlord, you have to make rough decisions at times and requires to be stern at times, which I hate doing, because naturally I'm a genuinely nice person, and in this case I thought I would have to put my foot down. I waited till mid-month, and it was time I would step in and pay a visit. When I arrived to the residence, I met one of my tenants outside taking the leaves. I asked about their fellow tenant who was late on the rent, and they said he hadn't been around for a few months, which was weird because I had the previous month's rent. And how would that even be possible? As dark and morbid as it can be, I thought I had one of those suicides in the room he rented. It's common and a scary thing to go through. The discovering of a body is something I had to deal with maybe 2 to 3 times a year. When I went to knock on the door, I was met by a pushing on the door, which just indicated the window was open, and the window pressure pushing against the wood. I waited a few minutes before entering the room and had one of my good tenants with me, since he was curious also. When walking in the room, we were hit in the face with a strong, heavy smell of bleach immediately. I knew what was going on. The tenant accompanying me immediately shook his head, and even he knew what had happened was not a good sign. As we walked around with a sort of investigation, we found the place nearly empty, with little to no furniture. A mattress in the living with a few bowls and cups, no TV or couch, a bag of laundry and old dried food on the countertop. When we got to the back bathroom, I told my tenant to hold back a few steps behind me, 'cause what we were about to find was not going to be pretty at all. I stood holding the bathroom door handle and slowly turning the handle and opened the door with a gentle push. There laid my tenant in the bathtub, sunken to the bottom with his feet sticking out from the top. I looked around the bathroom and found a few bottles of empty embalming fluid and a couple dozen bleach bottles lined up against the wall. I sat on the toilet and took out my phone and immediately called the proper people to handle this kind of situation. It didn't take long for a few police units to arrive, along with a coroner van, to come and fish him out of the tub, which I'm sure wasn't an easy thing to do, because he could have been in there for weeks, a month the most. After a few hours of letting them do their work, they brought out the body in a white plastic wrap, and since they found he had no kin, family at all, I had to identify him, or what was left of him. When I approached the plastic where they had his remains, they opened a Velcro flap and showed me. I could help but wince at the state of him, which was surprisingly nearly intact and not rotted as some would expect. His skin was white as snow, mouth wide open in the most hauntingly manner and eyes glossed over and sunken in. Hair a bright blonde from the bleach, obviously, and without a doubt it was him. After that whole ordeal and saddened turn of events, I had a cleaning crew who I've used before for this kind of situation. I was bothered by this more than I should have been, so I had that room closed off and boarded up till I felt it was right to rent it out again. A month after that situation, I had already moved my thoughts about it. I reopened the room and rented it to a nice young couple who needed a place. ASAP, I thought there couldn't no harm. They knew what had happened and didn't bother them none, so no harm done. Nice and quiet they were, friendly to the other tenants and worked good jobs, just the kind of people I liked. As I was sitting at home after having a nice full dinner and a movie, I fell asleep on my armchair where I did most of my sleeping. I fell into a deep sleep and dreamed of entering that room. I could feel the cold door handle and smell that smell of bleach. I dreamed of opening that door once more, and when I entered, I seen the tenant sitting up in the bathtub with his mouth wide open and closed eyes, his head turned towards me slowly, as I tried to move from fear but couldn't budge an inch. I had no choice but to stare at the tenant as he stared back at me with his eyes nearly closed and white face. I screamed as loud as I could while trying to move my body, and I quickly found myself back in my armchair, screaming from the dream and back into reality. The high anxiety and fear in my heart caused me to have a panic attack, which prompted me to turn on all my lights for the rest of that night. It's been 2 years since that incident, and at least twice a week, I have the same dream of the tenant. But each time I do, it seems like he's crawling further and further away from the bathtub to the point where I can feel his still fingers squeezing my shoulders. I'm in therapy because of this dream and experience, and at times I wonder if he's haunting me. If so, then why is he haunting me? I really do hope that the dreams stop sooner or later, but until then, I take my medication and wait to stop seeing his haunting wild face and blackened eyes. Wisconsin Feldgeister. In the summer of 2020, I worked in Plainfield, WI for a crop dusting operation. No, I wasn't a pilot, but I mixed pesticides and loaded them into the aircraft. We would work long hours, and I usually only got off around 8 p.m., but would usually have other busy work to finish after all 3 aircraft were landed and taken care of. One night in late July, it was around 10 p.m., and I had to fill up a jerry can with kerosene. The fuel was inside a shed that was on the property's edge, and behind it was a huge cornfield. As I walked to the shed, I had my flashlight on in one hand and the jerry can in the other, and I saw what looked like someone standing on the edge of the cornfield, and I assumed it must have been a farmer or maybe one of my co-workers. So I shined my light on the figure, and what I saw was an 8FT gray shadow figure. I said something like, "Hey, what's up?" Still assuming my eyes are playing tricks on me, and what I'm looking at is a person. After I called out to it, it turned around and just looked at me for a second, then turned back around to tend the crop. It's strange because I wasn't scared at the moment of this encounter and continued to walk to the shed and refilled the jerry can. It wasn't until I lied down in bed that the reality of what happened struck me. At first I thought it was an alien, but after further research I concluded that what I encountered was a Feldgeister. The wiki info states that a Feldgeister is a corn demon of German folklore. They are said to appear when corn is at its highest, which it was at the time of my encounter, and are supposed to protect the crop for whatever reason. I'm too lazy to give the full description, but I recommend giving it a wiki search. I also want to state that Wisconsin does have a large Polish and German population and replicates the same environmental conditions as well, which only supports my suspicion of why I encounter it at this very place and time. Has anyone ever heard of a Feldgeister before? Let me know what you think it was that I encountered. This is going to be long, so I apologize in advance, but it was creepy as hell. I was at the local grocery store I visit weekly to shop for food. I normally spend $100–200 a week on food for myself and my family, so I always leave with a full cart. I'm standing in the checkout line minding my business when a tall man, I'd guess early 40s, approached me and complimented my hair. "Your hair is gorgeous!" loud enough for everyone within a 20-foot radius to hear. Now, I appreciate a compliment as much as the next girl, but it was a little obnoxious to say the least. I thanked him politely and redirected my attention to my cart, where I awkwardly started organizing the items, in hopes that the 15 pairs of eyes now staring in my direction would look elsewhere. Unfortunately, Loudmouth didn't take the hint. He started asking rapid-fire questions, statements, barely pausing for me to get a word end edgewise before the next sentence would spill out of his mouth. This is when it gets really awkward, as if it wasn't weird enough. He asks if I want to go out with him sometime, maybe tonight after I put my groceries away. He could come to my house and help me put groceries away, and then we could leave from there. I told him I didn't think my husband would appreciate that, and he got angry. I was freaked out at this point, and everyone was still staring. After I rejected his offer, his mood changed so fast it was like a light switch got flipped, and the compliments turned into nasty insults and curses. Mind you, this guy didn't have a card or anything in his hand to buy. He was kind of standing off to the side, kind of leaning on one of the drink refrigerator displays. Thankfully, a gentleman who was in an aisle within my sight, who presumably heard the whole thing, came up behind us and asked him if he was in line. Loudmouth said no. Gentleman promptly told him he was being inappropriate, loud, and needed to buzz off. To my surprise, Loudmouth stepped aside and with one final insult and stomped out of the store. I thanked gentleman, and we continued waiting in line, me with an entire week of groceries and him with a bottle of Gatorade. I offered to let him go in front of me, and he declined, saying that he wasn't in a rush. It was really like one of those scenes in a movie where the nice tough guy saves the girl from the jackass. Even so, I was afraid Loudmouth would be waiting outside, so I asked the cashier to call one of her coworkers to walk me to my car. Gentleman insisted that he would be happy to escort me to my car, and I accepted. But as I stood there watching the cashier ring my items, I was overcome by this sick feeling like I was going to vomit everywhere. I decided it was just my nerves, as I have issues with anxiety, and this reaction is pretty normal. It typically passes within a few minutes once I mentally talk myself down. But for fear of further embarrassment, this time in the form of projectile vomiting in the middle of a grocery store, I hurriedly paid and took a seat on a bench close by. I told gentleman never mind and that I was a little freaked out, so I was going to call my husband to come pick me up instead. We'd get the car later. I didn't care. I just wanted to make it home in one piece. He told me to have a nice day and walked out the door. Hand to God. As soon as he walked out of the building, I felt normal again. So still blaming my anxiety, I felt sort of silly, but I'd already called my husband, so I stood up and pushed my cart over to the window to watch for my ride, just in time to see a junky white SUV drive by with, freaking wait for it, gentleman in the passenger seat and Loudmouth in the driver's seat. I about shit myself.